Thank you,
Thank you.
Rob. Before we begin, let me just state that Mr. Casey took a fall the other day, and although he walked away with I think it's 5 stitches, he's quite bruised. So he is going just to be speaking by audio.
We don't want to frighten any little children at home, so I want to save people from having to look at too much bad stuff. So anyway, who do you want us to lead off on? I'll just say one thing. My warning is fasten your seatbelt because there's still 2 weeks to go till the May primary. And if you haven't watched TV, have your clicker handy to be ready to mute or switch the channels. But who wants to lead off with the first question, or does Herb want to jump in and?
Well, let's talk about the format here. Do you want to ask us questions and let us respond? Do you want us to start talking? And then what are the opportunities for our listeners to ask questions?
Dr. Asher and Mr. Casey, I would prefer that you would start the presentation first.
Sure.
And then afterwards, we can go into a question format.
Okay. Terry, would you like to begin?
I'll kind of begin because in some ways you almost need a program to know what's happening on one day. And obviously today's Tuesday, and I've already mentioned that exactly 2 weeks from today is when we're going to have the primary. But the wrinkle is the primary on Tuesday for both Democrats and Republicans, and there's a few issue-only races around Ohio, but we'll have the statewide office holders like for governor, state auditor, attorney general, et cetera. There'll be 3 Ohio Supreme Court cases, but I don't think there are candidates, seats to be decided, but I don't think there's any primaries there. But then there's some local, like for county commissioner, county auditor in some counties, but in many cases there aren't primaries. But the big main event that's making the TV stations rich is the US Senate race. And then there's also Democrat and Republican primaries with different governor candidates running. And then there's all the congressional districts, at least on the map that was most recently adopted as Ohio shrunk down from 16 districts to 15. So as of right now, it could always change. The congressional will be decided, but what won't be decided, and probably maybe if and if there'll be an August 2nd primary for Ohio House and State Senate in the new districts, if and if, and then also like for State Central Committee. So it looks like we're going to have 2 primaries. We know when one of them is in 2 weeks. And then the other wrinkle upcoming is tomorrow, 3 federal judges, Judge Marbley from here and 2 appointed by the 6th Circuit Chief Judge from Kentucky, are going to decide on motions of whether or not to order a state legislative plan to be implemented, and then to decide when they have that. Is it an August 2nd special election to decide those legislative districts or not, because they couldn't get it agreed upon and approved in time for the election in 2 weeks. So that's a little bit of an overview. But again, if it seems confusing, it is because it's confusing. Why it's confusing is a whole other discussion, but does that kind of set the table a little bit that if you're feeling confused, it's not your fault, it's somebody else's fault.
Okay, I'll jump in and move from what Terry said to explain how is it that we will be having 2 primaries. And part of the problem here is that the Ohio Redistricting Commission, as well as the Ohio legislature, has not been very responsive to what the people of Ohio said when they passed 2 constitutional amendments to try to eliminate gerrymandering. So in fact, that is new from 2010, the last time we drew the districts. We actually have passed 2 constitutional amendments. And for the state legislative seats, we have a redistricting commission. And without going into all the details there, that commission is controlled by the GOP by a 5-2 margin. to in fact get a plan approved, they really need a bipartisan majority. Well, in fact, they didn't get that. They approved a plan with the 5 Republican members voting yes, the 2 Democrats voting no. It immediately went to the Ohio Supreme Court. In fact, that's what the constitutional amendment, and that's actually what Republicans wanted. They wanted it to go to the Ohio Supreme Court so Democrats would not be shopping around in federal court. When they sent it over to the Ohio Supreme Court, a number of the Republicans responsible for that plan, including the governor and I think the Secretary of State, said, it's not going to fly. It's not a good plan. We're going to be seeing it again, which told me that they knew that they did not follow the Constitution. And in fact, the court rejected it. And what's fascinating is they rejected it on a 4-3 vote. The 3 Democrats rejected it, plus 1 Republican, the Chief Justice, Maureen O'Connor. The other 3 Republicans said it was fine. Now, let me do a little bit of an aside here. We in Ohio have a tradition in our court system that when an issue comes up that affects the well-being of the political parties, it is often expected that the judges vote not according to the merits of the case, but according to the benefit of their own political party. And that's not the case in every other state in the country. So that's just off to the side. In this particular vote, Maureen O'Connor cast the only vote that I'm absolutely convinced is the principal vote. She rejected it, saying it didn't meet the requirements of the new constitutional amendment. The 3 Democrats also rejected it. And maybe they did it on grounds of principle, but maybe also they saw that their party wasn't favored by the plan the Republicans put up with, while the 3 Republican members of the court said, oh, it was fine. And I suspect they were, in fact, supporting their own party's position. As Terry was saying, what makes it confusing is the Supreme Court has rejected 1 plan, it's rejected a 2nd plan, it's rejected a 3rd plan, it's rejected a 4th plan. And so we now know we're going to have a later primary for the state legislative seats, but we still actually don't have an accepted and approved redistricting plan. What's upsetting about this is that all of this could have been avoided. The way that the plans should be working is that the plans should sort of reflect the preferences of Ohio voters over the last decade in terms of which party really is, the stronger party. That's the GOP. Republicans are the stronger party. They've won most elections, and a lot of people have been saying that a plan should be producing. For example, in the Ohio House, seats that even before an election is held, just seats that on paper on the numbers look like it might be 54-45 Republican, 56. 43 Republican, but more Republicans than Democrats. And that's very easy to do. And if they did do that, I'd predict the Republicans would, when you actually got to election day, would win closer to 60 seats because the Republicans are more skilled in candidate recruitment, fundraising, waging campaigns, and all of that. But the plan that was submitted by the redistricting committee to the court and subsequent plans tremendously, the Republicans got greedy, tremendously overrepresent. It tremendously gerrymandered, overrepresent the Republicans. And I'm thinking that wasn't necessary. You could have won more than the 54-55 by just having the election in November. So we've been going through this and nobody's quite sure whether a 5th plan will be accepted. In the 4th plan, they were talking about having 2 people come in, a Democrat and a Republican, to write a plan, and they got very close to it and ran out of time. Maybe they'll be asked to finish their plan, and I would predict if that's the case, it will be accepted by the court and be ideally approved by the redistricting commission, I should say. But Terry's so right. And then the Congressional, just to make this a little bit more complicated, we're going ahead with the Congressional, the US House primaries on May 3rd, there's still a chance, not very likely, that later the court could say, sorry, that congressional district plan is unconstitutional. So therefore, that primary that we had for Congress really doesn't hold. And we'll have the congressional primary also in August. And so, but this did not need to happen. The voters expressed their intent, and especially with respect to the state legislative seats, this should have been avoided. Republicans themselves who produced these plans knew that the court would reject them. I think they were hoping that Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, that the tug of party loyalty would get her to approve it, but she's really operating on the basis of the principles of the Constitution. So more power to her. Now, Terry and I have some thoughts about the Republican primary for US Senate. And I should let Terry, as he was warning you about commercials, let's let Terry talk about that primary.
Well, before we get into the US Senate thing, I might mention part of the confusion, and I been involved in redistricting in different ways over many different decades. But in 2013, I did a program with Dan Takaji, the OSU law professor, on an amendment that was before the voters in 2013. It was voted down by a pretty wide margin. Major newspapers like in Akron and Cleveland said no on it. But at that time, and still today, one of the confusions is everybody in an ideal world says we want all these districts to be compact, protect communities, and all be competitive. And there is a debate on how well you can do that, because Ohio's political geography is different today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, because today you don't see many white, more quasi-conservative Democrats like Vern Reif or Merle Shoemaker being elected from rural areas. So there's some legitimate question of which priority is the highest. And within that amendment, the key thing that the debate's been on is about Section 6, which says they shall attempt to draw. And it mentions representational fairness. But then also in that same section, it says, but first, they have to make sure that they follow sections 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7, which deals like how many counties do you keep whole, how many cities, townships, et cetera. So it's confusing, and I would argue that ultimately they're going to have to go back to the voters again and say, here's a revised plan, but somebody's going to have to choose. And by the way, Maureen O'Connor, who I've known and worked with when she was a judge and a prosecutor in Summit County, her position this year is not anything new or unique, because in 2011, when she was a member of the court, she voted no on the redistricting plan at that time. So she had clearly pre-warned that she was skeptical and not trusting in the process. But again, it's a debate of which section of the state constitution do you follow. And the other thing that people forget, in the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, it says the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senator and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature. So that's one of the things. But clearly in that section, it also says Congress could go ahead and make better rules, which they never have, or the court, which has been reluctant to jump into this, Supreme Court of the United States has not. So this is a tangled area that we aren't going to get solved this year. But my prediction is still, I think there's a 50-50 or better chance that the 3 federal judges will say, at least temporarily for this year, in order to meet all the legal requirements for early voting, overseas military, everything like that, they might impose one of the plans that the courts rejected, and then it'll come back to us then. And even though these plans have been debated, they had the option or the incentive to adopt a 10-year plan if you had it bipartisan, or as a penalty, if they couldn't agree bipartisanly, it was only a 4-year plan. So it's tangled. And I don't know whether Herb wants to follow up or disagree on anything I said.
Yeah, a few things. Since the 2013 amendment, the people of Ohio have overwhelmingly passed 2 other amendments. and they send a clear message that they want to, in fact, eliminate gerrymandering to the extent that you can. We all know that you can't maximize every criteria that you'd like, and you certainly cannot have all districts being competitive. That's simply impossible. It's impossible in most states. If you want districts to be compact, there's no way, in fact, you can have districts that are balanced competitively. But you can overall have districts that collectively better reflect the preferences of the people of the state. And I'm glad Terry brought up that Maureen O'Connor's vote a decade ago, because it does demonstrate that this is a person of principle. And she has interpreted, I think, the Ohio constitutional amendments quite correctly. So the challenge for all of us right now is, okay, we still don't have districts. Are we, in fact, finally going to get some districts? And cynics are saying, well, you know, Maureen O'Connor is actually term limited. And so she won't be on the court next year. She's term limited because of age. And it's likely that next year you'll have a court that's controlled by Republicans, but Maureen O'Connor will not be one of the Republicans. So let's see if we can just have a waiting game and then have the court, you know, go back to its usual behavior of parties voting with their party's interests. But I happen to think that Maureen O'Connor is the hero in this situation. And I do hope that with respect to the state legislative districts, that the fifth attempt is the successful attempt. Now, Terry and I have been following the Republican U.S. Senate primary campaign. And to say that it is, well, Terry, let me not put words in your mouth. Why don't you start? Because you're already hinting at how voters might want to turn the sound down on commercials.
Well, and to be fair, Herb, I warned people 9 months ago about making sure your mute button worked well on your TV remote control, that it would get bad, and in some ways got worse. But again, we still got 2 weeks to go. But I told one reporter yesterday, I said, this is like a cage fight, only a 3-level cage fight, because this would be a lot simpler if, say, we just had 2 candidates, Josh Mandel running against Gibbons. You know, it's easier to compare X versus Y, but we've got 5 main candidates running for US Senate, and all of them are either millionaires or close to millionaires. In some cases, 1 or 2 of them is a billionaire. And then we had last Friday, Trump come out and pick J.D. Vance to be his pick, which was surprising because they've been running commercials trashing him. And then you've got outside groups like Club for Growth and other kind of things, and people like Jane Timken, who people thought would be magically at the top of the list, but she's floundered a bit, and she's from a very wealthy family, and they put in some money, but not the mega millions that Gibbons had. So 3-level cage fight is a pretty good description, because you got people with Mandel attacking J.D. Vance and Timken, and then attacking Gibbons, and then Gibbons is attacking some of the other people. It gets confusing, and I would argue voter turnout is not going to be hugely high, because there is confusion on when's the primary going to be, and a lot of times when people are having all these negative attack ads all over the place, it causes people to say, I hate them all. And again, there's a 3-way Democrat Senate primary, but Tim Ryan's pretty easily going to coast home on that based on the polling. So the Senate race, if it seems ugly, it isn't that you're being negative, you're just being honest and truthful.
Yeah, I would say here that, you know, all other things being equal, in the state of Ohio now, we're not exactly a red state, but we're not a purple state either. We're a pink state now. Republicans have the advantage. And in general, for Democrats to win statewide, Republicans will have to screw up in some way, unless the Democrats somehow have Superman or Superwoman as their candidates or whatever. But, you know, going into an election, Republicans really are the favorites in general. How can the Republicans screw up? Well, one way they can screw up is they can nominate a candidate who is so far to the right that many of the remaining moderate Republicans and independents can't abide that. Or they could leave a primary so bitterly divided that they can never really unify, that people will be so mad. Or there can be corruption that really taints the Republican ticket. And, that really means that Democrats are less in control of their own fate than waiting upon other things to happen. And so Democrats, and I agree with Terry, Tim Ryan will be the candidate. And Tim is, sort of a traditional liberal. He's not one of these far out progressives or whatever. And Tim's sort of sitting there thinking, okay, I want the most extreme Republican candidate to win the primary under the ugliest circumstances. That's what he's wishing for. And I don't know who he would view as the most extreme Republican candidate, because as Terry indicated, they were all sort of moving in the direction of trying to win Donald Trump's support. And so they all moved to the right to some extent. But Tim Ryan is looking at this and saying, okay, if I'm running against J.D. Vance, I will go after him on his just inane comments about Ukraine. When Vance said, I don't really care what happens in Ukraine. I mean, that's not, some people may agree with them, but not that many. And if he goes after, if he's running against Josh Mandel, he'll have a field day. But again, he's at the mercy of what happens in the Republican primary and how it concludes. Because I think, as Terry is indicating, it may be the case that we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of the last 2 weeks of the campaign. And the issue of corruption, the feds are still in the state. They operate very, very slowly, as you now know. And they've done the indictments of the speaker, Householder, but they're still at work in Ohio. And we don't know whether there are going to be any more indictments and when they're going to come. And that's an imponderable. But going into this election, all other things being equal, you'd say, okay, yeah, the Republican statewide ticket, and the Republican incumbents are going to win, and the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate would certainly be the favorite. But there are these other things to keep in mind. But the Democrats really are more at the mercy of Republicans having problems than Democrats being able to win on the basis of their basic strength or issues or appeals or whatever. Terry, is that a fair comment?
Yeah, no, it's, and the other thing we haven't talked about is there's clearly, when you even watch shows like Meet the Press, even the more Democrat leaning pollsters and other people are making clear that some years the tides run in one way or the other. Example, 1982 was a big year when Dick Celeste won as governor, and the Republicans, it was the mid part of Ronald Reagan's term, and Republicans got crucified in 82. And then 94 was a bad year for Democrats because of reaction on Hillary care. And it ended up 94 was a year that Republicans swept the tide. So and 2010 was a big tide year for Republicans. So at least as of today, all the signs are that Biden is not doing that well. Democrats are not doing that well. That tide's going to make it tougher for the Democrats. But again, things can change, because honestly, I thought maybe a month ago, maybe how Ukraine would work out, it might help bring Biden back and his numbers up. So far, that hasn't happened. But again, who knows what's going to happen. But right now, inflation in the economy is probably the top issue, which is not helping the party in power. So that's another factor, but it is uphill, and we'll see how the primary works out. And Trump's endorsement of Vance might help bring him to the top, but he might win it with 33%. So we'll see how people coalesce and how they come together.
Yeah, I think, as Terry is saying, at the national level, I think there's widespread consensus that this could be a very good Republican year, where the Republicans could end up winning the US Senate and more likely the US House. And in part because it's a midterm election, the president's unpopular. As Terry said, inflation. The economy in terms of jobs is doing superbly, but in terms of inflation, it's doing terribly. But it turns out that the one thing the Democrats have going for them, this is not exactly a great positive, but when Biden won, and he had a decent victory in 2020, Democrats lost a lot of vulnerable seats. So it wasn't if the Biden victory swept in a lot of Democrats, they lost seats in 2020. So that means going into 2022, they've already have lost some of the vulnerable seats that you might have expected them to lose, in 2020. They're gone already. So it may be the case that if the Republicans win the House, it won't be by a huge margin. Unlike some other years where, there was a major landslide, you picked up 44, 50 seats, that sort of thing. But I think, as Terry said, going into the national elections, the Republicans are favored to win the US House. The US Senate is more iffy. And it's more iffy because, in fact, it depends upon, finally, who the nominees are. And we had some experience in past elections in Delaware and Nevada and Indiana, where the Republicans gave away 3 US Senate seats to the Democrats, not because the Democrats had such fantastic candidates, but the Republicans nominated, genuinely wacko candidates. And so I think you have to look at each state now and see, especially if it's a state that, Democrats would have the potential of winning, such as Ohio. Who do the Republicans give us as the nominee? I think, even though she probably won't win the primary, Jane Timken might have been the strongest general election candidate. Tim Dolan might have been the next strongest. I think, depending on how Josh Mandel wins or J.D. Vance wins, they may not be the strongest candidates. And so that may give the Democrats an opportunity. Democrats are hoping to pick up a U.S. Senate seat in Pennsylvania. And they certainly have a fighting chance, a good chance of doing this. And so it may be the case that the US Senate, maybe the Republicans will win, maybe it'll remain as close as it is, maybe the Democrats will have a slight lead, but that's still a much more competitive body as of today than it appears the US House is.
Is there a mechanism where people can post their questions? Because Herb and I can talk on and on, but we'd be interested in any specific questions from the audience that gets into anything on districts, the primary or the general. And also, Herb, as best I know today, I don't know of any big statewide issues that might be on the fall ballot. There's been rumbles that maybe petitions and marijuana will come up. I'm not sure that'll happen, but sometimes statewide issues drive turnout more than candidates do, and sometimes it's the other way around. But is there a mechanism for our audience? We love to hear questions, what's of interest to them, or if they agree or disagree on anything that either of us has said.
Mr. Casey will just ask the audience participants, does anybody have any questions? You can upload the questions through the chat if you don't want to just voice your questions.
And as we're waiting for possible questions, let me pick up on Terry's point about statewide issues. I don't know of any that are likely to be on the ballot, but sometimes groups, liberal and conservative, actually try to put issues on the ballot as a way of stimulating turnout among their supporters. So liberal groups oftentimes would want to put an issue on the ballot, raising the minimum wage, knowing that it'd be relatively popular and might bring out more young voters and liberal voters and things like that. And so parties do, in fact, at times, not because they really so much care about the issue, but they really want to affect the turnout profile. But I've not heard any of that yet this year. So I'm not sure if anybody else in the audience has heard of any issues like that, where it's really designed not so much to win the issue, but to win the other elections because you're stimulating or depressing turnout.
And the other factor that's been at play because of the pandemic the last 2 years, it's number one, it's fairly difficult because the massive number of signatures you need to get a statewide ballot issue on. But in the past 2 years, it's a lot more difficult for people to either go door to door or be perched outside of a library or a grocery store trying to get signatures because people have tried to lessen contact with other people. So I think a little bit of it's the pandemic, but it's also the expense and the hassle of it because it takes a lot of signatures to make the statewide ballot. And of course, some issues like the casino issue in 2009, there's people that thought corporate interests bought those signatures and bought the issue and bought their casino monopoly rights. And some people hated that. And at least a couple of people put up all the money and got the casinos liked it. So there's debate whether we go the California route where sometimes they have 4 to 8 statewide ballot issues on that creates almost overshadows the candidates who are running for office.
And
We do
Terry,
have
what
one
about that?
question.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we do have one question, and it's from Mr. Jackson. And he states that I was curious of your thoughts on the idea of bypassing the primary entirely.
I'll go first. I'm not sure legally how you do that because people forget in the Ohio Supreme Court they just can't go ahead and order an election on a certain date or to eliminate this or eliminate that because you really need the legislature to set the election dates and the election requirements. So the courts traditionally have been reluctant to get into that kind of thing, but I'm not sure mechanically how you would get into. I mean, there's some ways ultimately you could do it, but that isn't the normal course of things. People kind of expect the Democrats and Republicans to sort out their candidates, narrow the fields down. And so if you tried at this stage of the game to say, like for 99 Ohio House seats and 33 state Senate seats, so I think only 17 or 18 would be up this year. If you suddenly had mass things of 8, 10, or 5 or 12 candidates, that would make it even more confusing without a primary.
Yeah. If bypassing the primary means literally skipping a primary, we do have very detailed election laws and regulations that specify a whole set of steps, including filing petitions, declaring candidacy, having a primary. You really have to have a major change in state law, not mandated by the court, but in fact, done by the legislature. And that's just doesn't seem to be at all likely. I was going to jump in. We've heard in other states all sorts of allegations, and they're false, but about how much election fraud there was and how the election was stolen from Donald Trump, which is pure bullshit. But it's said in a lot of states by people who have their own political agendas. And let me just say here, in Ohio, we run very good elections. And we run very good elections in most states. And in fact, one has to give credit to the election professionals at the state level, the county level, the people who work on election day, primary and general election. It actually is a very good system. And Ohio's had a good system in place for a while. It can always be improved, I realize that, but it's had a good system in place. And just an old historical example and I don't know the age of the people in our audience, but But if you can remember back to the presidential election in Florida in 2000, where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and they were having problems with punch card voting and chads, and you had people holding these punch card ballots up to see whether there was actually a vote cast. We in Ohio already had made this legally. It said, okay, if you have punch card voting and if 3 of the 4 corners were pressed, and even though the chad didn't fall out, that was a valid vote. I mean, we had decided so many things already that were not to be left to the vagaries and discretion of whatever could happen on election day. So we've had some very good secretaries of state, and both Democrat and Republican. So we should be pleased. And I think by and large, our county-run elections have gone well. And of course, Terry, I'm saying that because you were very much involved in election administration. But I think that's a fair statement about Ohio.
Absolutely, Herb. And I think the big secret in Ohio is a couple different things. Number one, we have ballot rotation. So it isn't like one candidate is automatically always first. And that was part of the problem in Florida. They didn't have ballot
Absolutely.
rotation. But the biggest thing is in Ohio, there's 2 Republican members on each board of elections. There's 2 Democrats. There's a director and a deputy director, and they're of opposite parties. And I've done not only 14 years on the Franklin County Board of Elections, but have done recounts all over the state in the past 30 years, including last fall. And when you see the election up close, and when they're really that close, and I've had some state Ohio House races get down in the single digits, and that's where it really gets challenging and interesting. But we've got a good system and good people because it is bipartisan and there's a good check and balance on things. And other states don't do it that way. And that's part of what's created some of the problems that will come up. But in general, Ohio does have a good system because we've got good people. It's not perfect. I can point out to you different items of fraud and mischief that happen, but a lot of times it's people doing stupid things that don't know any better. But I haven't seen any massive examples in Ohio. And they've caught some. Remember down in Gallia County, they had a house that had about 50 some people voting by absentee out of one household. And of course, when that popped up, they realized something isn't right. And before the election, they caught it and corrected it.
Yeah, but actually in Ohio, to even use the word fraud suggests more than very, very few bad things happen. And a more common thing is you have some Ohioan who's a snowbird, moves to Florida, thinks they moved to Florida, registers in Florida, never told the election authorities here that they're really not an Ohio resident anymore, and they vote in 2 states and we find out about it. And they weren't committing fraud. I mean, it was wrong, but they just were very careless about their understanding that you can only be legally a resident of one state. I think we had a question that just came in.
We have several.
Great.
The first question is from Jerry, and he asks, he states that he has seen some reports that show the Democrats picking up seats in the House because of redistricting in some other states, such as New York. Any reports on that helping to keep the majority?
Yeah, well, actually, let me talk about that because it shows how Ohio Republicans are no different than New York Democrats, in the sense that New York State also passed an amendment that was to lessen the impact of gerrymandering, but the Democrats in the state legislature basically ignored that and approved a congressional redistricting plan that might have gained the Democrats, I think maybe 3 seats in New York. Now, very recently, a week or 2 ago, a federal judge in New York declared it unconstitutional. It'll be appealed to a higher court. If it goes to a higher court controlled by Democrats and they vote their party rather than the legitimate issue, Democrats may in fact pick up some seats in New York when in fact it was thought that they would lose some. So I think the point of the question is very good because this is going on as a state by state battle. and it's going into the courts, it's in the legislature and things like that. And just keep in mind what's happening here in Ohio. We had 16 seats, and of those 16 seats, 12 were held by Republicans, 4 by Democrats. So Republicans had 75% of the seats. They didn't get anywhere near 75% of the popular vote. Part of the reason they had such an advantage was because of gerrymandered districts, gerrymandered by Republicans. So now we're down to 15. Control of the US House of Representatives, for this year, for 2022, is critical. When Ohio was 12-4 in favor of the Republicans, that gave the Republicans a net advantage of 8 seats from Ohio in building a Republican majority, which they didn't quite get in 2020. Now we have 15 seats. What's going to be the breakdown? There was some suggestion that the first Republican plan would have been 13-2 in favor of the Republicans. That's really greedy on my view. And that would give the Republicans a net advantage of 11. Well, maybe it's 12-3, but I think a reasonable outcome, without drawing all the maps, is 9-6 in favor of the Republicans, 60% of the seats. Why? Because the Republican vote is more strategically placed, Democratic vote's more concentrated and all that. But 9-6 isn't good enough for the Republican National Committee, because that only gives you a net advantage coming out of Ohio of 3 Republican seats in terms of winning control of the US House. So maybe it'll be 10-5. And so it's this kind of calculation that's going on in lots of states. And the New York example is a good one, because I think, from what I understand, the Democrats in the legislature sort of treated the Constitution with the same lack of respect that the Republicans on the redistricting commission treated our constitutional amendments. But again, these things are going into courts. And as the questioner asked, this is happening. There are issues happening in North Carolina and Florida and Wisconsin and a variety of other places. I understand, and maybe Terry knows more about this, that in Texas, where the Republicans control everything, they actually were more concerned in drawing the districts to protect incumbents than they were in adding many more Republican seats. And so you get a sense here of how political this is. And some people call it a game, but it's a game with consequences.
Well, in the New York State thing, if you notice the slide on the screen, that was taken off. I did a thing last fall for the CBS National News with their White House correspondent, came to Columbus, and he was comparing what was happening in Ohio to New York. And New York had actually passed a constitutional amendment for a fairer system, and the legislature basically just totally ignored it and went off, and at least until this one judge stopped it, at least temporarily, it would have yielded like about 87% of the districts going to the Democrats. But one word of caution, when people bring up these indexes can change from year to year, because example, with the same map drawn by Republicans, I think that in the 2002 through 2010 elections, Republicans drew the map, but it got to nearly even. And then in 2010, 5 different Democrat incumbents lost. An example here in Franklin County, the 15th district that Deborah Price had in 2006, it was a dead heat recount between her and Mary Jo Kilroy. Then in 2008, Deborah Price didn't run, Stivers did, almost a dead heat again. And then in 2010, all the same district, Stivers ends up winning by 13%. So these indexes that people come up with might be an accurate indicator, but they can be way off dependent upon the national trends and flow one way or the other. And then also, who do you have as candidates running? And what kind of campaigns do they run? How much money do they raise? How well do they spend it? What messages do they develop? So they call it political science, Herb, but sometimes it's art form and it doesn't always replicate year after year after year.
Dr.
there
Ash,
are,
I have another question.
yes,
Great.
next
If
question.
Trump's pick loses, what does that say about Trump's influence in Ohio?
If JD Vance loses,
Yes.
well, there'll be wonderful spin going on from the Trump people. And if he loses, and he loses by a narrow margin, then in fact, the Trump people will be saying, well, you should have seen how far behind JD Vance was before Trump endorsed him. So Trump's endorsement helped him improve his performance by 10, 15, 20%, but it just didn't get him quite over the top. So Trump will never accept that notion, or the Trump people in the Trump organization. Likewise, that if JD Vance wins, they'll all be crowing about how influential the president is. But look, if lots of candidates, Trump is still very popular in Ohio. One election doesn't determine his influence, but I think people will look nationally, and if they see here that in general Trump endorsements made a positive difference, that will reinforce the narrative that the Republican Party is still the party of Donald Trump. And if in fact a lot of Trump endorsed candidates lose, the media will all sort of in harmony say, well, this really opens up 2024 for other Republicans to start thinking about running for president. So it's a game here of trying to interpret outcomes and just watch what the media do. But your question is very good, because I'd love to see the spin doctors spinning the reporters who have to decide what's the best interpretation. Now, if it turns out, Terry and I will be asked what we think that means, and if it turns out that JD Vance loses by 30 points, which he's not, we'll say, oh my God, the Trump endorsement had the opposite effect, because we know he's running decently right now. And I think for Donald Trump, the idea was that JD Vance is running close enough to Josh Mandel. Most polls have Mandel in first place, that maybe the Trump endorsement can push JD Vance over the top. And then that gives Donald Trump, bragging reasons.
And one of the points is in the polling, the general consensus is that initially Mandel was more significantly ahead as Gibbons spent millions and millions. He kind of went maybe ahead. Vance was a little farther back. But clearly, if Vance does win, Trump can take a lot of credit for it. But in primary, polling is really difficult, and especially among Republicans, because there's a lot of people. Number one, in polling today, it's hard to reach people on the phone because they get so many robocalls and so many other distractions. Most people don't want to answer. And then there's a certain number of people that like to tell the pollster the opposite of what they think because they're angry with maybe the national media or something like that. So polling in primaries is always tough, but it's gotten even more tougher in the last couple of years. But Herb's the expert on polling because he's written textbooks on it for college students.
Yeah. Terry, have you seen any evidence, whether in robocalls or mailings or things like that, that JD, or even TV ads, that JD Vance is really now fully taking advantage of the Trump endorsement?
Well, I know that the endorsement came out Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, I had seen an ad come out on his independent PAC with the money from the West Coast billionaire. He already had an ad up promoting the Trump endorsement. So there's bound to be some more ads. And then when Trump is in Delaware County Saturday night, I'm sure they're going to have a video crew taping what he's going to do, and there'll be commercials next week featuring that. So they'll
because
use it and exploit it.
Because an endorsement is important, but it has to be exploited. And remember, people are already voting.
Yeah, but the sense I have is the early voting in this primary is there's some of it that's going on, but it's not been that heavy because I think most people know the polls are not going to be that crowded. And also there's a lot of people, to be honest, that want to show up on election day. That way they've got the most current information and they like to see some of their neighbors at the polling places. But the great thing in Ohio is one of the 10 most liberal states in terms of you can vote roughly 4 weeks out in person at the Board of Elections. You can vote by mail starting 4 weeks out, and then you've got election day. So Ohio is one of the easier states compared to New York and some others that make it a lot harder to be able to vote early and vote when it's convenient.
Yeah, we actually had a system in place that actually much better met the needs of people living through a pandemic in terms of giving them the opportunity to vote in a variety of ways. That's right.
What other questions do we have? We're open to any and all.
I have another question from Chris. She asked if you have not yet entered. Excuse me, that's the wrong question. What about a voting process that removed primaries from selecting the candidate? Something like Final Four nonpartisan voting.
I think California does some kind of a system like that. So in some cases recently, you've had two Democrat Senate candidates run against each other because so there's some different ways of doing things. I don't know whether that improves things because there are questions whether some people will switch parties in order to pick the weaker person on the other side. So there's pros and cons of what works better, but at least Ohio in the near future, I don't see any great rush what they've done in California. There's actually a country in South America, Uruguay, where they have one election and you kind of vote on, do you want the Colorado party, or I forget the name of the other party down there. And then you vote for the candidate you like, and then depend upon which party gets the most, then the candidate in that party is the one that becomes like the equivalent of their member of Congress, et cetera. But there's a few differences around the world that are done, but I don't know that anybody's proven that one is perfectly better than another.
One of the motivations behind the California system was to try to create better conditions to nominate more moderate centrist candidates. The argument being that in states where you have extensive gerrymandering, like Ohio, the most meaningful election becomes the primary. And so if the primary election is the key election in a heavily Republican district, how do you go about winning the Republican primary? Who are the Republican primary voters? They tend to be the activists. They tend to be the more conservative people. So the Republican primary may in fact generate a very, very conservative Republican nominee. And there's no need for that nominee to move back to the center in the general election because it's a heavily Republican district. Likewise, for the heavily Democratic districts, how do you win the Democratic primary? You appeal to the activists, the hardcore liberals. And then when you win the primary, do you have to move to the center to get elected in November? No. So all of a sudden, and obviously I'm exaggerating this a little, but all of a sudden you're sending to the legislature Republicans who are more conservative than the average Republican, Democrats who are more liberal than the average Democrat. And guess what happens? These extreme conservatives and these extreme liberals get to the legislature and you have polarization. What a shocker. That's part of what's going on here. That's too simplistic an explanation of polarization. But gerrymandering contributes to it. And so the thought behind California was, let's see if we can find a system whereby you can get more moderate candidates. Another possibility, and Ohio used to be a national leader this decades and decades and decades ago, is you could have preference voting. Yeah. So when you vote in the Republican primary, if there's 5 candidates, you'd say, here's my number 1 candidate, my number 2 candidate, number 3, number 4, number 5. And in order to win the primary, you have to get 50% of the preference. I don't want to go into all the details here, but if nobody was the number 1 choice of 50%, then the candidate who finished last, his supporters, their ballots would now be looked to see, well, who was your second choice and your third choice? And then those get assigned to the remaining candidates. And you go through this iterative kind of process until somebody has gotten above 50%. Now, what's good about a system like that is, you could vote for a candidate as your first choice and know that even if that person has no chance, you can express your view, but your vote won't be wasted. Because if nobody gets 50%, they'll start tabulating your preferences for second choice, third choice, fourth choice. That's addressing a different problem, but it's certainly another way to vote.
And Herb, I think in New York City last fall, when they elected their mayor, they did some kind of a ranked choice kind of thing like that. And Eric Adams was the initial winner. Then they did mathematical reallocations, which of course added to the confusion. Obviously, he was the mayor, but it's sometimes gets confusing when you do that, and wondered who's doing the magic with the numbers and the counting.
Can I? Do we have time to tell a story from the great city of Ann Arbor?
Absolutely.
Decades ago, Ann Arbor moved to preference voting. And they were having a contest for mayor. And there were 3 candidates running. A Republican, a Democrat, and a radical feminist bus driver. They were the 3 candidates. And it was preference voting. And so you indicated who was your first choice, who was your second choice, who was your third choice. The Republican got, and you needed 50% to win. The Republican got close to 49.8% of the first choices. The Democrat got 40%, and the radical feminist bus driver got the remaining 10 point something. So nobody won because you had to have 50%, but the radical feminist bus driver lost. And so now you looked at all the ballots of all those people who voted for her in first place and looked at who was their second choice. And almost unanimously, their second choice was the Democrat. So the Democrat got elected mayor, even though in the first place choices, he only had 40% and the Republican had 49.8. But the system worked exactly how it was intended to work. But it so shocked the voters in Ann Arbor, it seems so counterintuitive, that they repealed the system for the next election. Going to Terry's point about confusion or whatever.
Yeah, Americans are very much of a sports driven, and they kind of like to know who won. Of course, sometimes after the game, they'll debate whether a call by the officials were right or wrong. And to pick up on one of Herb's points about polarization, we definitely have polarization. That's part of the problem for different reasons. But I also give a lot of blame and credit to the rise of social media, whether it's talk radio, whether it's cable TV, where you can tune in and hear what you want to hear. And there's less, particularly as newspaper readership has sunk so low. And again, the rise of cable networks that reinforce whatever opinion, left or right, you have, it's kind of drawn us more apart because we don't have that common well of information to draw from that most people agree and trust.
That's right. You know, where for the older ones among us, where is Walter Cronkite, who could end the news broadcast and say, and that's the way it was? You know, Terry's absolutely right. I mean, I think social media has so many, well, and the expansion, look, the internet, the web. I mean, no matter what you believe, you can find now other groups and entities out there who agree with you. There have always been, bigots and racists in the country, but in the past, there wasn't as much social support for them. You didn't have a lot of people who you could turn to who would agree with you and agree with you online, which means you now have the protection of anonymity and privacy. So no, I think we're recognizing here that social media really is a challenge, and one of the most savvy politicians who understands how you can use social media to create dissension, division, is Vladimir Putin. Russia spends a lot of money and time interfering in elections in other countries. When Putin absolutely hated Angela Merkel because she was really tough on him, and there was issues in Germany about migration or immigration, and there were a number of phony events that wound up going online about young girl raped in Bavaria by immigrant, and it went viral. And it just made people even more angry. Well, it turns out this was part of the Russian disinformation campaign. I hope our disinformation campaigns in the United States, as it applies to other countries, are as effective.
What other questions do we have from the audience, or have we worn them out or put them to sleep?
Well, Terry, could you elaborate on the power in the Constitution given to legislatures to choose members of Congress?
Well, as I mentioned, the US Constitution is very clear in Article 1, Section 4, that it is the legislature that sets the, quote, time, place, and manner of holding elections. But I also did note, if you read further in that, it also does give Congress the opportunity, if they could agree on how to do it and limit or decide which is the highest priority and how to sort it out. Because one of the difficulties is everyone would agree that we want to have, quote, fair elections or fair maps. The difficulty is, how do you define it? And in a state like Ohio, do you keep as many counties whole as possible? And then when you get into urban counties, how do you split them up? So there's a lot of difficulties in how you, what priorities do you take? And people will sometimes say, well, the computer could just make the maps, and it's possible, but somebody's got to tell the computer. And haven't been involved in drawing districts in the past. One of the difficulties is that, like, if 15 congressional districts, and if Herb and I sat down together, we could start out, but then we'll have this district, boy, it's compact, it's got communities of interest, it's reasonably competitive, it looks good. Then we got this one. So drawing the first 3, 4, or 5 districts is fairly easy, but then you have bits and pieces left over. And I remember in 1981, Jim Tilling was doing the statewide legislative map, and I was kind of working on within Franklin County, which was going to have 8 whole districts. And Jim had finished up the rest of the state, but he had the western half of Pickaway County, and he had no place to put it. So the problem is you have bits and pieces. So what he ended up doing is saying, well, let's graft that part of Pickaway County onto Franklin County. And that all kind of worked out. It's just that the member from Franklin County that had that part of Pickaway County didn't like to have another county to work in. But it's just the difficulty if you got bits and pieces. And in congressional districts in Ohio, every district's got to have exactly 786,630 people, because some federal judges over time, there's a couple technical exceptions, but in most cases, they say they want every district to be exactly equal in size. So that means you got to have a lot more split precincts and census tracts and blocks in order to get all those 15 districts matching up exactly. And it doesn't make sense because the census is not exactly correct. But in the US Constitution, it basically says the legislature is the one that does it. So that's why they have it the legislature as opposed to the legislative districts in Ohio are made up by this reapportionment board that goes back to, I think, after the 1966 one man, one vote case out of the US Supreme Court.
Yeah, the legislature really determines the elections. It doesn't determine who gets elected. It's responsible for the districts and things like that. There was a time when US senators were selected by state legislatures. Literally, there was no public general election. It was the state legislature, but we got rid of that. And so in fact now, people do the election, but they do the election in districts that are drawn by typically either state legislatures or commissions or whatever other group there might be in that state. But it also turns out that Congress is the final judge of its own membership. So Congress can, in fact, literally have a case where they might say, we're not going to seat this person. Happens very, very infrequently. So we really do have a federal system where different people have different responsibilities, but ultimately it falls back to we, the voters, who elect the members of Congress and who also elect our state legislatures.
And rightly or wrongly, the US Supreme Court, and I think we had a case about a year ago, because I remember doing a program for the Columbus Metropolitan Club with the chief lawyer for the ACLU and a couple other people, but basically the US Supreme Court could have jumped in and said, time out, here's how you need to do the districts. But the judges, rightly or wrongly, of the Supreme Court decided we don't want to jump into that, what you might call briar patch of politics, because different states do different things, and we don't have that clear national standard from the court or from Congress.
Mr. Casey and Dr. Asher, it's 12:57, so we only have 3 minutes left. I do not see any other questions in the chat, so can I give this for final comment?
Okay.
Herb?
Terry, go on.
Again, I've mentioned fasten your seatbelts because the next 2 weeks, I think we'll not only get the part of the primary over, I think there's a chance 50% or higher the federal judges jump in. But again, it's only going to be temporary because in all probability in early 23, we're going to have to come back with another round or two of the debates. And again, I predict there's going to be a new constitutional amendment or two that might take another stab at better defining how the process should work.
Terry's mentioned, maybe there will be a new constitutional amendment. One outstanding citizen of Ohio who had been working on fighting gerrymandering, improving redistricting all of her life, a very prominent member of the League of Women Voters, was just a wonderful citizen by the name of Peg Rosenfield. And Peg died about a month ago. And in her obituary, in the Columbus Dispatch, her obituary read, Peg Rosenfield died March 11th, 2022, after a long battle with the Ohio legislature. And all of us who read that were just stunned and said how true that was, and said, if we indeed had another million people like Peg, we'd have the best election system that could be designed. So I think as Terry said, we're always in the process, especially on the issue of redistricting and gerrymandering, of trying to do it better. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank both of you for joining us and imparting all the information on gerrymandering and redistricting and other issues facing world politics today. Thanks again. I think you're great. You've been great to Colera, because I know, I've done the communications in the past. No need to ask for your photos or no need to ask for your bios, because, it's like implanted there with so many past presentations that you've given us. So on behalf of Colera and the Colera board, we want to thank you both.
It's always fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Hopefully I will see you at the next event, which is Colera Table Talks next Tuesday. See you all then.
Okay.
Bye.